everyone, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Anam and I'm a DEI and anti-racism facilitator based in Vancouver, BC. And before I start this video, I would just like to take a second to acknowledge that I am living and working on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, namely the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. This video is a little different. It's relevant in a way which is devastating, and it bears a reality that I know a lot of us, especially in Vancouver, will be deeply affected by. Over the last week or so, I have been watching the ways in which the Vancouver community has come together to support the Filipino community after the tragedy that occurred at the Lapu-Lapu Festival last week. I won't say too much about this, given that I know that this dialogue can be really activating for a lot of us, but I'd like to make my position very clear. I'm here to provide whatever support I can in whatever ways I can. This workshop is a small step towards ensuring that we are providing trauma-informed and intentional support where we can, and to make sure that we're doing this in a way that decenters ourselves and centers our community. In terms of the workshop content itself, we're going to be talking about accessible allyship and activism, and this is all about using the resources that you've been granted or given to find an entry point to supporting which feels sustainable and non-exhaustive. Of course, allyship and activism inherently require discomfort. It's almost a given that standing behind a community is going to ask you to do some hard work. But our jobs are to make sure that the way that we are doing this work is productive and isn't harming the community that we aim to uphold in the long run. There are a few things that we'll be going through today, but I'll just go through these learning objectives so you can get familiar with them and keep them in mind as we go through the content. So we'll be defining allyship and activism, or redefining for some of you. We'll be unpicking some fears surrounding taking action and describing what a sustainable and accessible practice of allyship and activism looks like, and also describing some practical applications of some key takeaways from the workshop. Okay, jumping right into the content, we're going to talk about allyship first. And allyship is all about understanding and harnessing your own privilege to lend yourself to a community that can benefit from resources and supports. Now, really pay attention to the word privilege there, because being removed from any kind of oppression in any context is a form of privilege. And when you have this freedom of movement, but also this freedom from any kind of grief, you possess to some extent resources and capacity that can benefit the community around you. Allyship is about intentional and informed engagement. It's about active listening and centering the voices of those most impacted. It's about acknowledging your own positionality and abilities to provide support and acting on these in a way which is sustainable and responds directly to the needs communicated by the community you're supporting. Allyship is therefore inherently about care. It's also so important to remember that allyship is a journey and not a destination. It has to be continuous and it has to adapt. The terrains that we work on are changing all the time, and the way in which we engage with the community in one time may not be as effective in moments of heightened affect. And it's all about gauging these shifts and seeing where the gaps in resources and supports lie and seeing how you can bridge those gaps. As well as this, allyship should be present beyond moments of crises, because authentic allyship requires continuous education, conversation, and dialogue about building structural supports that can sustain themselves beyond these moments. So you often see activism and allyship go hand in hand, and activism is just about taking that step further and actively addressing the structural inequities that cause harm. It, again, must be sustained, and it must listen to the voices of those most impacted. Activism often addresses a much broader social movement towards equity and change, and while, again, activism and allyship can go hand in hand, care has to be present authentically for that to happen. It can be seen as a much more strategic approach to allyship, that intentionally targets structures that cause oppression and harm, as well as holding the community in question at the core of the movement. Now, when I say direct action, I mean action that is pinpointing areas of need, and this action can be physical and disruptive, and please bear in mind that I'm using disruptive with a positive connotation here, but so it can be disruptive like protests and rallies and community gatherings, but it can also be behind the scenes work. Now, understanding the definition of direct action can be really central to making allyship and activism accessible, because there's an issue that often arises that people tend to assume that there's only one type of action that constitutes activism, and when they hold that assumption, it tends to be tied to that physical disruptive work. And this can steer people away from engaging because that kind of action is just not viable for everybody. There are people in the community to take on that role, and they're incredible, but again, it's just not accessible for everybody all the time. We all have different levels of abilities that determine the ways in which we engage in this kind of work, and accessible action establishes multiple points of entry for us. Physical disruption is one of them, but so are policy assessments, amending practices, hosting conversations, sharing educational resources, donating and generating resources. There's a lot of options, and keep in mind that allyship and community building is like a puzzle, and I'm sure that you've heard this before, but everybody takes on a different role, and all these roles come together to form that structural strength and cohesion. And when we engage in a way that feels accessible to us, we're able to make an impact that is sustained and not sporadic. And because, remember, allyship needs to extend beyond moments of crises, this sustainability becomes the core of forming the strength of community. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this workshop that there are inherent feelings of discomfort that come with being an active ally and taking direct action because it requires you to move past your own voice and stand quite strongly in the belief that things can change and things can get better, and this can bring up a lot of fear and hesitation for folks. I want you to pause this video for a second. Grab a piece of paper and list all the fears that come to mind when you think of allyship and activism. What stops you from engaging? And when you're done, just play the video again and we'll talk about it. Okay, now that you have your list, let's go through some common fears and try to get to the core of where they come from and what we can do about them. So the first two of these we can actually group together because the fear of making mistakes comes from the fear of not being trusted because we don't want to cause harm. We may also fear the perception of imperfection or inauthenticity, but I want to affirm that there is no one way of being a successful ally, and as long as your intentions are in the right place and you're willing to learn, your community will offer you grace. Like I said before, the terrains change and they're changing all the time, and making mistakes is about learning what works and what doesn't. So try to remind yourself that everybody is on a learning journey. A possible way to move past this fear is to talk to others about what is needed and to strategize with others about ways to build and provide the resources that are needed. Taking up space is also a very real fear because, again, you don't want to cause harm. But we can talk about this fear in two dimensions. The first is that you have the right to take up space as an ally because action comes from taking up space and complicity comes from being quiet. That's just how it is. And the second dimension is that you have a responsibility to take up space in the way that your community needs you to. Again, have conversations, ask questions. No one is expecting you to get this right intuitively, and a community of care will offer you that space to be inquisitive and learn. Now, the fear of power dynamics is also very real because power dynamics are present all around us. The word activism seems to be almost taboo in certain spaces, and we have very real fears of repercussions and power dynamics being abused when you partake in active allyship. Be sure to be cued into what protects you, and more importantly, what spaces will hold you and honor your allyship without it coming at your expense. Really tune into what values you want to uphold and make sure that the spaces you're in are upholding those with you. And finally, the fear of ineffectiveness and burnout can really take a toll on the ways in which we engage. But I encourage you to keep the message on the right here in mind. Remember that you're working towards a purpose. Remember that you're in this position because you hold some privileges which can be of service to others. And as we know, our privilege is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. Discomfort is part of the process, but it'll help you achieve a more equitable and just world in the long run. At the same time, make sure you're balancing your community care and self-care, whether this means decompressing, talking to a friend, or finding ways to engage that feel more accessible. When we build the muscle of giving without fear of imperfection or scarcity, we become truly in tune with our community and make community care and action feel regenerative and healing. Now, part of moving past that discomfort, but also really tuning into it, is asking yourself hard questions. And now these questions will help you align your intention with your impact. So, some questions you can ask yourself: is the way that I'm engaging beneficial to the community I want to support? Have I taken the leadership of the community I want to support? What is a point of entry that aligns with the community needs and feels accessible and sustainable for me? And how can I engage in a way that doesn't let the community I'm supporting be disadvantaged by a lack of sustainability? And once you've asked yourself those hard questions and you've gauged with your community what is needed, here are some ways that you can go about bridging those gaps that go a little bit beyond just the physical disruption. So, of course, you can go to protests and demonstrations, but you can also address policies within your workplace. You can contact relevant government officials, write templates for emails, write templates for messages, amplify resources and supports, accompany folks to access supports, create spaces for conversations, generate and donate resources, donate time and make time, and also reevaluate your personal practices to make sure that they're aligning with the values that you want to uphold. Now, this week's lab task or learning application practice task is to consider one way in which you can engage with and support a community in need over the next week. Start a conversation by sharing a resource, which can be anything from a donations link to a GoFundMe page to an educational social media post or anything of the sort, about this community with a group of friends. Really get that dialogue going and see where that can take you. And that's that. Thank you for watching and thank you for engaging. This is obviously a pre-recording, and I would love to offer you a space where you can actively engage with each other and ask questions. So if you'd like that, let me know and I can figure that out. Before I fully wrap up, I would just like to encourage you to keep supporting the Filipino community in Vancouver. This is a heightened time for a lot of us, and I know that there's been a lot of community resources in place specifically, but I hope that those resources feel accessible to you, and if you need any support in accessing them, please let me know. I'd be happy to do what I can. And if you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments or message me with them, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But until then, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.